guys, this is Kat and I have a tutorial for ZBrush Core. So today we'll be talking about creating this pendant, and it is a design that would be easily cast in silver or could even be printed in resin to use for sand casting. Now the main important feature of this is that it has no undercuts. So let me slice this guy in half and show you what I'm talking about if you're not familiar with it. But you can see here when I cut the piece in half that if I were printing this, you'll see that it gently starts out here to go up to the design, and then it falls off. It has a nice smooth fall off here that would make it very easy to sand cast. So this type of design is going to be something useful hopefully in anything you're doing. Now where I'm using these is I'm making enamel frames. So I'll cast this in silver, and then I might actually come back in with transparent enamels. Any raised areas would create a design that was different colored under a transparent enamel. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, start over here under the tool palette with a cylinder 3D. And when we load this onto the canvas, I'm going to make sure my floor is turned on, but I'll load the cylinder in. And the first thing I notice when I do this is that there's a lot of rectangles. These vertical rectangles are just kind of chunky looking, and I need something that's a lot smoother. If I were to click and drag and then press the shift key to look directly down, you'll see these little lines here around the edge. So it's not smooth. So our first step is to smooth this out so we end up with something that's better to work with. One of the tools I use to work in this way, I guess, is to turn on a polyframe to actually make that visible. So by pressing Shift F, you can bring up the underlying mesh under your cylinder. If you tilt it to the top, you'll see that there's some triangles, but then the sides are a lot of rectangles. Now I can change this within ZBrush Core to make that a lot smoother. I closed everything up, but down here on the right is an initialize function. If I slide the slider for H divide all the way over, it gives me many more rectangles, which results in a smoother surface, and this will work just fine. Now I'll turn the polyframe on and off here so you can see the mesh. Now under V divide, I actually shrink that down to 3, although it doesn't usually accept it. It might jump up to 4, but that's okay. The other thing is I can adjust the size, and in this case it's the Z size. I sometimes have to experiment with the 3 of them to make sure I'm getting the right thing. Or I can also type in the number 10, which is the thickness that I want here. This isn't to scale, so it's just a percentage. So for example, this is 10% of the original size, so that's how that works. Now at this point, my disc is literally just a shrunk down disc. It's a little bit smoother. You can see if I'm looking from the top, it's definitely round. So this looks good so far. But one of the problems is that these triangles here won't let me draw. I can't actually sculpt on this surface yet for one of 2 reasons. One is that this is not a polymesh 3D. If I were to try and start sculpting on it, it won't let me. It just basically doesn't give me the option. So I need to convert this first into a polymesh 3D, and then we need to adjust the resolution to give us a clear design. If I look to the right here under the tool palette, there is a button that says Make Polymesh 3D. Now if I have polyframes turned on, and also this line and fill are toggled on, if they're white, that means that they're active, then this will turn a color. So if I click Polymesh 3D, immediately this turns to a different color. It might be green, might be pink. It'll randomly select a color. You'll notice that the polyframe button is still highlighted orange. And if I want to real quickly just toggle on and off the fill and toggle on and off the lines, you can see that those are actually toggles and sometimes I would accidentally click on those and not understand why I wasn't seeing the lines. So make sure you click the middle of the button, but you can then toggle these on and off if you need to later. But definitely the color tells me that this is part of something called a polygroup. And polygroups are a way that we can separate things within ZBrush. Now, we'll take a side note here, and you won't have this on your screen, but I'll switch back to the original that we were looking at. And you'll see that this actually has different colors. And what that means is that there are 3 distinct polygroups here on this other pendant we looked at. When we turn off the polyframe, it just looks like a silver pendant. If I turn on the polyframe visibility, you'll see that there's 3 different colors. Where this is important though, is I can then isolate this poly group here by pressing Command-Shift on a Mac or Control-Shift on a PC. And when I isolate it, I can then go into, say, like the deformation menu, and I could maybe shrink that down and make it a skinnier jump ring. And then by clicking on the background with Command and Shift or Control Shift, I can bring back the rest of the pendant. So as far as isolating things, there's a feature within regular ZBrush that allows me to split into parts or split into similar parts, which gives me the ability to manipulate these individual pieces. However, that functionality is not in ZBrush Core, but I can use these poly groups, which it's actually automatically assigning these. I can use these groups to isolate parts of my model and work on individual pieces. So just kind of good to know. All right, so I'll bring that back, and let's go back to our original cylinder. So here we are with our cylinder, and you'll see that there's the triangles on the top and the rectangles on the sides. I need to convert this into a mesh that we can sculpt. So under the geometry menu or palette, you'll see that there's a function called Dynamesh. If you click on Dynamesh to open up this sub-palette, you'll see that there's a resolution already set of 128. Also, Groups, Polish, and Project will also be turned off, so we want to leave those off. But if I click on the Dynamesh button with 128 as my resolution, what you'll see is my disk now has a mesh on it. If I turn off the polyframes, make sure I have the standard brush chosen, and I start drawing, you'll see that I can now sculpt on the surface, but this is very, very pixelated. And if I turn polyframe back on, you can see that that pixelization relates to that underlying mesh. So if I want this to be a lot smoother, I might make that mesh a little bit finer. So let's undo. In fact, I'm going to turn on polyframes. I can see I've still got a mesh, so I can undo one more time, which is Command-Z on a Mac and whatever it is on a PC. But I'll slide this slider over here for resolution, where you can just type in a number. But let's go to 256 and Dynamesh and see what happens. It takes a little bit longer, but I have a finer grid. And so what this grid means is if I come in here and start drawing, you still see the pixelization, but it's a lot smoother. You can play around with this a little bit, so I'll undo twice to get back here. And let me take that up to, let's say, 512. See what happens. Dynamesh again. And you'll see that it's a very, very fine mesh, but notice I've got the spinning beach ball of death, which says this is taking a little bit longer to process. The other thing you'll notice too, if you've been watching what I'm doing, up here on active points, we started out with a very low active points count, like in the hundreds. With each one of these resolutions, the finer the resolution, the higher the active points. And there's some of the videos on YouTube or some other ones I know of where people are working in the 10 to 12 million point range. And I like to keep these under about 1 million to 2 million at the very most. But most of my smaller designs like this one may end up being under 1 million points with really great resolution. So 486 is still well within spec. So let's see, let's go ahead and leave it at 512 for now. And that will be a good resolution for what we're doing. One other side note, if I talk about size a little bit here, this disk that we brought in, or this primitive when we brought it into ZBrush Core, was 2 units wide by 2 units in depth by 2 units high. Now, as a jeweler, I'm using those units as millimeters. So if this disk was 2 by 2 by 2, and of course now it's less than that, but if that's the scale that I'm using, then a resolution of 512 is sufficient. However, when we're done with this, it's going to be maybe 16 to 20 millimeters wide, and we'll actually use a lower resolution. So if I started out with something and resized it to 16, I might use a 64 resolution, because basically the larger your model, the lower resolution that it's going to require to get that smoothness again. So with that, let's go ahead and just continue on with this smaller size. We'll resize again later. Now with the Dynamesh, it's been chosen. Okay, we have this at a resolution of 512, but let's try drawing. So if I draw again with my standard brush, you'll notice that this is nice and clean and beautiful. And the other thing to keep in mind is that pendant might be very small. And you can see that this resolution it goes away. Even if it was a little coarser, if we had used the 256, we still would have sufficient resolution to make this pendant. It actually will get down to the fineness of your design then. But I tend to work big, and then when I shrink it down, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's not at all what I wanted. So I think it's important to kind of zoom out every once in a while and just check your design. So let's zoom back in, and again, I'll undo to get us back to an original polymesh disc. The other thing I want to do is to go to the File menu up here, and let's go ahead and save this disc. I'll call it blank disc. I'll also put the resolution, so I'll call it PM for polymesh and 512. And then I might also say it's a 2mm disc. Now later, I don't have to go through those steps. I can simply load in that project, and when I load it in, I've got the disc ready to go. Okay, so the next step is to create a design, but we want to do that with radial symmetry. And let's go to Transform, which is where we find the symmetry function. I turn on symmetry, and it has a shortcut of X. So if you want to use your shortcuts, it's a good habit to get into. But with this, I don't know what axis I want symmetry about. Now this kind of takes you back to elementary school days or middle school, and maybe your first geometry classes. And you know that there's a y-axis, an x-axis, and then z front to back. It's not as easy to see here, but this green line tells me that I would want symmetry about the y-axis, which is represented in green. If I go to the Move mode by pressing W, the default in ZBrush Core is to have this thing called a gizmo, and the gizmo will show me where my axes are. Again, green is up and down, X is red and it's side to side, and then Z is blue and that's front to back. So that gives us an idea of where our axes are. If we don't use the gizmo, if we turn that off, you can also click on the surface once and it will show you a Z, an X, and a Y. So this actually gives you the letters that go along with it. But regardless, that'll work just fine. So it tells me my transformation. I need to activate symmetry on the y-axis with radial symmetry, which is going to give it a round. And the other thing to make sure that's checked is mirror symmetry. So at this point, we have symmetry turned on and we can start drawing. So go ahead and switch back to the draw mode, which is, you can get there by pressing Q, and you'll see that we have these little dots on the surface which represent symmetry. Now if I start drawing, I can make a design, but I can't keep the thickness or the height or depth, I guess, of this design consistent. I can sculpt. This is great for sculpting flowers and things like that. But the first time I did a design like this and then I printed it, there was nothing there. It was so, the design was not prominent enough to actually show up. So what we want to do then is let's undo and go back to our blank disc. We're going to use a different technique, which is to use a mask to create a design and then raise it. So to get there, we'll press Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, and that will bring up something called the mask pen. And you can double check up here. I have a draw size of 25 and a focal shift of 0. We'll talk about focal shift here shortly. But if I click and drag, and if you're using a pen, you want to make sure that you're pressing down very, very hard because you want a nice solid line. If I were to raise this real quick and just watch what I'm doing, if I were to raise this, you'll see something interesting. So you can see that this is all one height, except for there's some variation here. Well, let me show you another trick. While I'm drawing like this, let me switch back to the draw mode. If by chance I start out soft and then go hard like that, what you'll see is that the areas of gray represent different heights like that. So we'll see that this is kind of, nice and thick, where these other ones are kind of gray. So let me raise this one and I'll show you the difference. Turn off the symmetry. And this isn't a perfect example, but you can see that these are definitely not all the same height. So it's a good idea to have them all dark like that. So let's undo one more time. So let's draw again, switching back to the draw mode and turning on symmetry by pressing X. And let's go ahead and I'm going to draw very, very dark like this. That'll work. Then I could maybe put a dot right here. The thing is to simplify your designs, because one of the things that I know about creating these kinds of pendants is when you zoom out, you know, if you zoom out and this is the size of your pendant, that's what you're going to see. So if you get very detailed, you sometimes won't ever see the design at all. In fact, this one's kind of borderline, so let's back up. I might increase the size of my brush a little bit. There's a good thick line. I make a dot right there. Okay, that's something that it's a little bit thicker. Let me reverse it. And turn off symmetry by pressing X, and then raise it. And then there's a design. If I do that, you can see at a smaller size, that's actually pretty visible. All right, so getting back. Here we go. So again, click and drag and press the Shift key. Make sure you're in the draw mode. Turn on symmetry by pressing X. You can adjust your size down. I like to draw, maybe put my drawing down in the maybe 26, 27. And then my focal shift, let me show you one other trick. If you take focal shift and move it all the way down, and you have to have the Command or Control key pressed, because you'll notice that in this case, my focal shift is -16 when I'm drawing. But if I press that key, it shifts back up to 0. Let's move that all the way down. And what that means is that there's no fade on the edges. So if I click and drag like this, you can see it's a lot harsher line. But let me reverse. Oh, and the way that I did reverse, I don't think I ever said it. You hold down Command or Control and then click on the background. Select Move. I'll turn off symmetry to make it a little easier. Click, and then hold your Shift key, but you'll notice that this is what you get. Now these edges or these walls are very vertical, which in some cases may not print correctly. And the other thing is it's just very rough. So by blending the edges of this, which is what your focal shift does, it will give you a lot softer fall off on this and make it a lot better. So we'll go back one more and use draw, turn on X for your symmetry, press down Command or Control, and then let's adjust our focal shift up back to 0. Or somewhere around there. It can be just rough. But then we'll go ahead and we'll draw a design. I'm gonna block off an area here. Maybe I'm gonna set a stone here. And if I'm not getting that round, watch this trick too. I can go back to transform and I can make my radial count a lot higher, and this will give you a nice perfect circle like that. Okay, so if I were doing a bezel or, you know, getting a place to set a stone, you can increase it that way. Now I'll turn that back, so I'll click here and just type in 8 and hit enter, and go back to drawing. So I might put a little thing here, a dot here, maybe a little doohickey like that. That looks good. Now let's reverse this. So press Command or Control and click on the background, and let's try to raise it. So we'll go back to the move mode, tap X to turn off the symmetry, click on this middle circle to raise, and use the Shift key. And you can see that that's pretty cool. There's some things in here that aren't quite right, but that's okay. But you can see this levels off at the top. It's kind of a flat top like that. But let's try something else. If you undo and go back, you'll notice that we have our design here. Let's soften it. So if you hold down Command or Control and click on the disc, it actually blurs. Now you can turn it and then use your move tool or your transpose line to raise that. And you'll see that it's softening a little bit, but I might undo again. tap on that surface, it blurred again, and then raise it. But you can just go back and forth to see what works for you. And it's hard to tell, but what you're seeing is with each time you blur it, you get a lot more fall off right here. And we could go back and adjust the height of this, but this one's very prominent, but we might want to know exactly how high that is. So with that, we can go ahead and leave it for now. And if you need to clean it up, you can use your brushes. So I could go in and use like I used a smooth, but it wasn't symmetrical. So I can tap X to make that symmetrical. One of my other favorite tools is the Move tool, that you could come in here and maybe even increase the size of your brush. I pressed S, but you can move that in and smooth it out like that. Anyway, you can enhance it. This one's not perfect. I would probably go back and redraw it, but you get the idea. So that gives us a nice raised design. So the next step is to add the frame. And the easiest way to do that is to use the subtool palette, and we'll append another piece. But come to think of it, let's go ahead and adjust the size, because I think the size, we need to know what the thickness is of this disc before we do anything else. Now, to do that, the easiest thing I can do is zoom way out and turn off your symmetry, so press X. Switch to the Move tool or the Move mode and turn off the gizmo. We need this little transpose line right here. Now we'll click on here and drag all the way out and just let it go. And I'm looking up here on the left-hand side, and yours may say millimeters. If it doesn't, you can go to Preferences, Transpose Units, and set the units. But however, it's showing that this line, the length of the line I just drew was 10.7 millimeters. I can pick this up by clicking on the line and then click on this circle and use the Shift key again and bring this out until it's about 16 millimeters, and that's fine. So this is the size that it needs to be versus the size it is. So this one in the middle is about 2 millimeters and this line is 16. We need to increase it. So if we go to the deformation menu down here, or palette, you can use the size function and make sure that X, Y, and Z are turned on, so they're white. Now you'll go once, which makes that 4 millimeters across. You can then do this again. It doubles it, so that would be 8 millimeters across. And now you can click and drag again, and that should give us 16 millimeters across. So it's doubling each time that you do that. And so you'll see now that this is an actual size. This one is 16 millimeters. That also tells me, though, that the thickness is probably going to be too much. So we can use our transpose line and click on this top edge right here, click and drag down. And it doesn't have to be exact. It will snap on the bottom. So it's telling me this is 1.65 millimeters, and that's actually too thick. So I need to decrease the size of this. So I'll just drag this down a little bit, click and drag, hold your Shift key. But that gives us now a gauge. So if this starts at 0, and then right now you can see it's at 1.6. If you click up here where these axes meet, click, and then you can drag, you can see that there's a 1 millimeter mark right there. Okay, so I just went a little bit less than that. And it needs to be about 0.9. So again, click in the middle where those axes meet, and you can drag down, and then maybe go, let's say I had somebody tell me 0.9 was good, but 0.8 has worked for me. So you want to just basically clip that side off, and you do it with this transpose tool. At this point, I can also see what the height of my design is. So the same thing. In fact, since I've already selected this edge here, I can click on Y, and it will reverse the axis up. And I can see about how high that is. And what I see here is that it's about 0.97 maybe. If I wanted to adjust that one as well, I can click here and maybe cut off part of the top, maybe bring it to 0.9 again, and then double check to make sure that looks good. But it basically flattened and sheared off the top of your design. If you wanted to soften that a little bit, you could go to the deformation menu and choose polish. So I can change this little dot over here to a closed dot, and then slide over a little bit and get that a nice polish on the top. Okay, so that's one way to do that as well. All right, so now our known elements are that our raised text is 0.9. So on Shapeways, for example, it has to be maybe 0.6, or they'll have a requirement for the depth of anything that's coming up off the surface. If it's 0.2 or 0.3, it's not going to show up. You know, maybe 0.6 would work just fine. But this back plate right here, I'm going to put at 0.9 because if you're casting, then that needs to be a little bit thicker. So there is our medallion, and now let's go ahead and add the ring. So close up your menus over here, a little bit of housekeeping, and get the Subtool palette open. Choose Append from the buttons at the bottom and look for Ring 3D. And it may have a number after it, but anything that's Ring 3D, it'll work. Now I can't see the ring. The ring is there, but if I rotate to the back, you'll see it. Go ahead and click on the ring and make it the active subtool. But the first thing I need to do is to make this bigger. And I know from experience that making a jump ring that's about a 4mm jump ring is good for the top of a pendant. So if you go to the deformation palette and then choose size again, you can basically double its size by going 100, and that actually doubles the size. If we know that it's coming in as a 2mm, this is now a 4mm jump ring. The other thing that I can see is that it is, when it's about that size, I also know the thickness. And if I were to turn on transparency over here, it's towards the bottom, I can go in and use this little transpose tool. It went off the screen, so I can click somewhere on the ring. If I click over on the background, it'll just rotate. So you have to click on the active subtool, and I can zoom in, but then I can pick this up and line it up here on the bottom. Just line it up, kind of eyeball it. And then you can kind of get a look for what's the thickness of the ring. And so this shows that it's 0.8 of a millimeter, which is about the thickness of a 20 gauge piece of wire. And so that is actually castable. That should work fine. Now, if Shapeways or somebody wants that a little bit thicker, if they need that unsupported thing to be thicker, you can then go to deformation, and you could even, see if we zoom in, you could use inflate, and the inflate tool will make that a little bit fatter. And then you can just move your transpose line over by clicking on it, and you can see it's probably about 0.88 now. So there is making our little ring a little thicker. Now all that's left to do is to move it into position. So if you turn on the Gizmo 3D by pressing Y, you can then click on this blue arrow here to move it up to the top. So I needed to move it a little bit more, and we'll see it. Oh, and I did the ring before the frame, but that's okay. Anyway, but I'll go ahead and center it here just for now, and then we'll add the other ring and adjust later. Okay, so there we have a jump ring added. Now to go back, we need to do the next step. We'll clean this one up in a minute. But we need to add the frame, which is what we meant to do earlier. But we'll go ahead and append, and then choose again Ring 3D. Now when I turn this ring on, you'll see it's here in the middle again, and I still have transparency active. But in order to expand this one and make it larger, you'll attack it with this little yellow square down here. And this is a new part of ZBrush, but you can see that with that square, it proportionally increases the size. And then you can go to the deformation palette again and choose inflate, but go negative. And you might have to do this several times to get it the right size. Anyway, you just make that frame the size you want it to be. You can move it over. I still have the gizmo active. Generally, I'll make that the same depth as the pendant on the front. So, and then let's deflate a little bit more just to make it nice. Okay, and I can see though that this is not quite thick enough with my pendant. So the other thing I can do is I can increase the width. So I'm using this little rectangle here. I'll increase the width, and I will chop it off here in a minute. So this isn't quite a perfectly round one, but it gives me a nice sort of rounded bezel with it. So that looks pretty decent. And I could even increase the size maybe a little bit more. There we go. Now the other thing that you'll notice here is that this frame is kind of chunky looking. And so to smooth that out, the easiest way to do that, even if you use the polish here in deformation, it won't do it. You need to give it more geometry. And so anytime you have a problem with this geometry, turn on your poly frame and see what's going on. So you can see that there are a lot of rectangles here. And the geometry, if we go to the geometry palette and choose divide, you'll see that it divides this. So if you do this a couple times, turn the poly frame visibility off. You can see it's starting to get nice and smooth. So we divided it, but we want to delete the lower subdivisions. And what that means is there's a slider here that says I can go back to my original version, and then I divided the geometry and it got smoother, and I divided again and it got much smoother. I can delete those lower levels because I don't need them. I can also look and see that this ring right now has about 33,000 points. So it's got a lot of points to it. And then my total points is all of the points of all of the subtools combined. And let's see what else I see here. Okay, I might end up coming in and actually cutting this frame off a little bit just to make it look good. Or I could even increase it by using the inflate. So if I go back to inflate, I can make that a little bit fatter. And that looks good. But then I might also trim it off at the top. And if you wanted to trim it at the top, I mean, a couple different ways you can do it. But one, I can move this down. So if I wanted that to be a nice, smooth, rounded top there, I could just bring that so it's even with the design. That looks good. But then I might want to chop some off. And the way that I can do that is if I turn this off, turn off the gizmo, and then click somewhere on here and drag using the shift key up, then I can zoom in, and then remember at the intersection of the axes, I went the wrong way, so I'll undo, switch it. So I just clicked on the Y, and then I can use this to make this line up with the other one. There we go. So it has a nice rounded front on the back, but the back is nice and flat. So that's looking pretty good. Now, if you want to see more of what it looks like, you can turn off transpose and see, and that's pretty flat on the back. So I'm liking that. And double check, I guess our little jump ring here is in a good place. We could actually move it a little bit. Let's close up some of these guys. And let's see, make sure I've got the jump ring. In fact, let's name these. So this ring right here, if I go down, I can choose rename and call jump ring. I have to spell it right. There's my jump ring, and then here's the frame. So there we go. So let's select the jump ring, and then I can, with the move tool, I can turn my gizmo back on, and then I can move this front to back. So maybe move it back just a little bit. And that looks good. Ooh, I do see that there's a little bit peeking out here on the bottom. So what I'll do is then use this axis or this little arrow here and move it up so it's out of the way, and that looks pretty good. All right, now if I were wanting to print this, I need to merge all of these together, because if I export it, sometimes it's only exporting the current subtool. So we need to combine these into one unit. So now if I were to turn on the poly frame, you'll see that that one's purple, this ring is blue, and this one is pink. When I merge these together though, select the top subtool and choose merge and then merge down, you'll see that it retains some color differences here. So even though this is merged, even though it is merged, that we can go back in and adjust these separately. And there was one other thing I wanted to do. Now that these are all together, you'll notice there's a little tiny line here on the back. Let's see if we can erase that by going to, let's see, the move tool and turn off the gizmo. We will click and drag let's see. I'm new to using this technique. Okay, so start on the left and then drag out with a shift key. And then let's see if we can shave a little bit off the back. And that looks good. So you can see it erase that line. In fact, you don't even have to be looking at it on the side. Just as long as the axis has been set correctly, you can then adjust it like this. So, oh, let's undo. There we go. So I'll go to the point where I see that, and then I'll go back one tiny, tiny notch. There we go. Kind of fiddle with it. There it is. And there is a function within the full version of ZBrush called Clip Curve or Clip Rectangle that does this really nicely, but it's not in ZBrush Core. But that works just fine. So anyway, there is one last thing that I noticed though, is that this design is not quite lined up at the top. So an easy way to do that, remember that we have different poly groups. So let's turn our polyframe on so we can see the poly groups. And I want to isolate this particular centerpiece. So switch to the draw mode and then hold down Command and Shift on a Mac, Control Shift on a PC, and look for Select Rect. When you have Select Rect chosen, then you can click here on the center and it turns off the other one. So you click on the one that you want to be active. Then I could go to the deformation menu and I need to figure out what my axis is here. So it looks like I'm looking at rotating about the Y-axis. Go to the draw menu, go to rotate. I'm going to turn on Y and turn off everything else. And now I can rotate this slightly. Now, if I hold down Command and Shift or Control Shift and click on the background, it brings back the frame and everything's lined up. Also, similarly, I can isolate this jump ring up here. So if I hold down Command Shift, Control Shift, and isolate that, I could also then inflate or deflate that a little bit if I needed to. When I'm done, hold down Command Shift, click on the background and bring it back. So turn off polyframe and there is my piece. It's ready to print. And at this point I can choose export and export this as a .obj and then bring it into preform and be able to print it.